had always believed that every person carried a secret dream inside them, a quiet vision of the life they wished they could live if only circumstances allowed it. For me, that dream had always taken the shape of a house by the ocean. As a little girl, I used to walk barefoot on the sand, watching the waves roll in and break apart as if they were secrets whispered to the shore, and I promised myself that one day I would own a place where the windows would be filled, not with the gray blur of city streets, but with the endless horizon, where the scent of salt and the sound of gulls would become as natural to me as breathing. Life, however, had a way of silencing dreams, tucking them behind bills, responsibilities, sacrifices, and the long compromises that marriage demanded. Still, that little flame never died out completely. It lived quietly, patiently, until the moment I decided to finally reach for it. When I bought the beach house, it felt almost unreal, like I had stepped into a memory I had imagined too many times to count. The house itself wasn't extravagant in the way some people might picture luxury, but it was exactly what I had always wanted. Whitewashed walls kissed by the sun, wide glass doors that opened straight onto a terrace overlooking the sea, weathered wooden beams that made every corner feel both rustic and timeless. I chose every detail carefully, the soft linen curtains that would sway with the sea breeze, the muted tones of sand and driftwood inside, the wide open spaces where light poured in from every direction. It wasn't simply a house. It was a declaration to myself that my years of dedication, of building and saving, of putting others' needs before my own, had not been in vain. I had earned this. I remember the day the keys were placed in my hand. They were cold metal, heavy and ordinary, and yet to me, they carried the weight of every sacrifice I had ever made. I closed my fist around them and felt something shift inside me, as if the girl who had once dreamed by the shore had finally found her way home. I walked through each room slowly that first afternoon, running my hand along the banister, pausing in the kitchen where the sun slanted through the window in golden patterns, stepping onto the balcony where the horizon spread open like a secret just for me. I breathed it in, the salt, the light, the silence, and I thought, this is mine. It wasn't a gift from anyone, not from my parents, not from luck, and certainly not from my husband. It was my own decision, my own money, my own courage that made it possible. That thought filled me with a strange pride, but also a quiet relief. For so long I had poured everything I had into keeping our marriage stable, into supporting his ambitions, into smoothing over the rough edges of our life together. Somewhere in the midst of all that effort, I had lost sight of myself. This house was my way of reclaiming that part of me. I didn't buy it to show off or to prove a point. I bought it because I wanted a place where I could feel whole again, where I could wake up to the sound of waves and remember that I existed outside of anyone else's expectations. I had imagined sharing it with him, of course. Despite the cracks that had begun to appear in our relationship, despite the growing distance that seemed to stretch further with each year, I still believed, perhaps naively, that he would stand beside me and see what I saw. I pictured us having coffee on the terrace in the morning, watching the sun climb out of the sea, or walking hand in hand down the beach in the evenings as the tide crept in. I thought perhaps this house might heal what was quietly breaking, that it might remind us of why we had chosen each other in the first place. I clung to that fragile hope, even as something inside me whispered that it was already too late. But on that first day, I didn't think of endings. I thought only of beginnings. I unpacked a single suitcase I had brought, placing books on the shelves, a photograph on the bedside table, a vase of fresh flowers in the living room. I walked barefoot across the cool tiled floor, listening to the distant crash of the waves and the occasional creak of the beams above, and for the first time in years I felt something close to happiness. It was quiet. It was fragile, but it was real. That night I opened the windows wide and let the sound of the ocean fill the house like a lullaby. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the life I was about to build here. It was supposed to be ours, a shared chapter, a second chance. I had no way of knowing then that the very person I thought I was building this for would see it differently, that he would twist my dream into a stage for betrayal. For now, though, I allowed myself to believe. The house was mine. The dream was alive, and I thought it would be enough to save everything else. The truth, of course, was that it would save me, but not in the way I imagined. This house, My dream house by the sea would become the witness of something far darker than I had ever anticipated, but also the place where I would finally learn that strength is not in holding on to what is broken, but in knowing when to let it fall apart and claim the pieces for yourself. For now, I simply fell asleep with the ocean breathing outside my window, unaware that the walls I loved so dearly would soon echo with a truth I never wanted to hear. The first weeks in the beach house passed with a strange mixture of tranquility and anticipation, as if I were slowly learning to breathe again after having held my breath for too many years. I tried to bring him into that space with me, inviting him for weekends, suggesting we plan gatherings or quiet dinners by the sea, but excuses always seemed to surface. There was work, travel, obligations I couldn't question, without sounding like the suspicious, nagging wife I had never wanted to be. I convinced myself it was temporary, that soon he would carve out the time, that once he stepped into the house and saw what I saw, he would understand why it mattered so much to me. I still wanted to believe we shared the same vision of what our life could be. It was on a quiet afternoon, one I had planned to spend alone with a book and the sea breeze, that I decided on a whim to drive down earlier than expected. The house had begun to feel like a sanctuary, a place where I could be myself without the weight of his constant absence, and I wanted to linger in that solitude. As I approached the driveway, I noticed another car parked outside, a sleek black vehicle that didn't belong to any of our neighbors. At first, I thought perhaps the real estate agent had returned with a contractor, or maybe there was a mistake. I slowed down, my pulse quickening, a knot forming in my stomach that I tried to dismiss as paranoia. When I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, I froze. Voices floated through the air, light and cheerful, echoing from the living room. I walked silently, my steps cautious against the cool tiles, and then I saw them. He was standing there, his back to me, gesturing broadly with his hands as if painting a picture of the future. Beside him was a woman I didn't know, though something in the way she tilted her head toward him, laughing softly, made me understand everything without a single word of explanation. She was younger, with that polished, careless beauty that comes from knowing you are the center of someone's attention. Her eyes sparkled as she followed his hand across the room, as if she could already see herself living inside the vision he described. "This will be ours," he said, his voice warm, filled with a tenderness I hadn't heard in years. He led her toward the wide glass doors, sliding them open so the salty wind rushed in. "Imagine mornings here together, the sound of the waves, no interruptions. Just us." His hand rested lightly on her back, possessive and gentle at once, and the smile that spread across his face was not one he had ever given me. Not anymore. Maybe once, long ago, but not now. I stood in the shadow of the hallway, invisible yet present, my heart pounding with a rhythm that felt foreign. There was no scream rising in my throat, no violent urge to throw something, no hysteria. Instead, there was a hollow clarity, a coldness that wrapped around me like armor. I realized, with a sharpness that almost stole my breath, that I was witnessing not a mistake or a fleeting lapse, but a decision. He wasn't hiding her in that moment. He was openly claiming a future with her inside the house I had bought with my own hands, my own sacrifices. The betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It was tangible, standing barefoot on my balcony, smiling at the ocean as if it belonged to them. They moved through the rooms together, and I followed at a distance, silent as a ghost. He showed her the kitchen where I had imagined us cooking side by side, the bedroom where I had placed a photograph of us on the nightstand, the terrace where I had dreamed we might sit with coffee and rediscover each other. He erased me from every corner with each word, replacing me with her in his narrative. I watched the way she nodded eagerly, clinging to his vision, her laughter filling spaces that had only known my silence until then. It was almost unbearable, and yet I couldn't look away. When they finally returned to the living room, he wrapped his arm around her shoulders and whispered something that made her blush. I couldn't catch the words, but I caught the meaning. It was intimacy, promises, a life they were already building in their minds. And then he said the sentence that carved itself into me like a blade. "We'll live here together." The simplicity of it, the certainty in his tone, was devastating. He had erased me completely, spoken as if I didn't exist, as if my dreams, my sacrifices, my love had all been nothing more than scaffolding for him to climb into someone else's arms. I should have walked in then, demanded answers, shattered the illusion with my presence. But something in me resisted. Instead, I stepped back, retreating into the shadows as they gathered their things to leave. My silence was deliberate, a choice that felt heavier than confrontation. I realized I would gain nothing by exposing myself in that moment, nothing by begging for explanations that would only deepen the wound. Let him think he was still in control. Let him believe his deception was complete. There was power in withholding, in waiting, in gathering not only evidence but also composure. When the door closed behind them and the sound of their laughter faded down the driveway, I remained standing in the stillness of the house, listening to the ocean beat against the shore like a reminder that time never stops, that waves keep coming whether you're ready or not. The house suddenly felt different, altered, tainted by the memory of their presence. But beneath that stain, another truth began to crystallize inside me. I wasn't helpless. This was my house, my name, my dream. He had trespassed not only into my trust, but into something I had built for myself, and for that, I would not forgive him lightly. I closed the glass doors, drew the curtains, and sat down at the table with my hands folded tightly together. The image of his smile lingered in my mind, but so did the silence I had maintained. It was no longer the silence of shock or despair. It was the silence of calculation. He thought he had written me out of the story, but I was still here, holding the pen, waiting for the right moment to strike through every line he had spoken and replace it with my own. The house had been my dream, and he had dared to steal it in front of my eyes. That was the moment I decided. He would never set foot inside here again. He just didn't know it yet. There are moments in life when words stop being mere sounds and become something else entirely, something that can pierce deeper than any blade, not because of their volume or the force with which they are delivered, but because of the quiet certainty behind them. I had heard countless lies before, little excuses whispered over the years, phrases designed to soothe or manipulate, but none of them had the weight of that single sentence. This will be our home. I replayed it again and again in my mind after he had spoken it. The way his voice didn't falter, the way his arm tightened around her as if sealing a vow, the way his smile reached his eyes in a way it had long ago stopped reaching mine. It was not a slip of the tongue, not a careless phrase tossed into the air. It was a declaration, one he believed enough to say out loud in the house that I had bought, in the dream I had carved for myself. I stood there, unseen, as the words sank into me, burning through every layer of denial I had built around our marriage. I had always known something was wrong. The distance between us wasn't just about work or exhaustion. It was in the way he no longer asked me about my day, the way his eyes skimmed past me at dinners, the way silence stretched between us like a canyon we could no longer bridge. Still, I had clung to hope, telling myself that couples go through rough seasons, that if I gave more, supported more, waited longer, he would eventually remember me, that one day he would turn back toward me with the same warmth he once had. But standing in that house, hearing him gift my dream to another woman, I understood the truth. He hadn't forgotten me. He had replaced me. The cruelty of it was almost elegant. He hadn't chosen a random place to stage his fantasy with her. He had chosen my sanctuary, the house I had worked for, the one thing in my life that was entirely mine. He had taken the embodiment of my years of sacrifice and turned it into the stage for his betrayal. And the way he said it, calm, assured, with that softness that once melted me, it was as if he were rehearsing a script they had already written together. There was no hesitation, no shame, no awareness that what he was saying might be overheard or discovered. He spoke as though the world had already shifted, as though I were no longer a factor, no longer present in the equation of his future. That was what cut the deepest, the realization that he had erased me so completely in his mind that he no longer even considered the possibility of my existence interfering with his plans. The woman beside him smiled at those words, her hand resting lightly on his chest, her eyes darting around the room as if she could already picture herself arranging furniture, filling shelves, placing photographs where mine had once stood. It was in that moment I realized she wasn't just a passing distraction. She was a co-conspirator, someone who had been fed promises for long enough to believe they were real. I wondered if she knew whose money had bought the house, whose years of sacrifice had made it possible, whose dreams were being quietly stolen beneath her painted smile. Perhaps she did and didn't care, or perhaps she believed the lies he had told her, the stories of a wife who no longer loved him, of a marriage that was already broken. Whatever she thought, I knew one thing. She was not an accident in his life. She was a choice. The sentence echoed inside me long after they had left. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the grain of the wood, hearing the ocean outside but no longer finding comfort in it. It wasn't the betrayal itself that left me trembling. It was the clarity that came with it. For years, I had carried the weight of our marriage, convincing myself that love was measured by endurance, that my ability to forgive and to hold us together was proof of strength. But what strength is there in holding on to something that has already been released by the other hand? His words had not only revealed the affair, they had freed me from the illusion that there was anything left to salvage. He had already given himself away, already built a future without me, already spoken it into existence. And yet, even as the wound bled fresh, something colder than grief began to rise inside me. It wasn't rage, though perhaps rage would have been easier. It wasn't despair either. It was calculation. His sentence had been a declaration, yes, but it was also evidence. He had given me the key to his undoing without even realizing it. By speaking those words in that house, by claiming what was mine as if it were his, he had set into motion the very mechanism that would destroy him. Because while he believed I would crumble, cry, plead, what he didn't know was that silence is not always weakness. Sometimes silence is strategy. I began to see the path forming before me. I didn't need to scream or confront. I didn't need to tear myself apart demanding explanations that would only humiliate me further. What I needed was patience. Patience to gather what I needed. To shift the house from ours to mine in a way that was not only emotional but legal, undeniable, final. I imagined the look on his face when he returned, certain that his fantasy was secure, only to find that the very ground beneath him had vanished, that the home he had promised to another would never belong to him. The thought steadied me, like the first deep breath after drowning. That night, I wrote his words down on a piece of paper. This will be our home. I stared at the sentence until it blurred, until it became both a scar and a weapon. He thought it was a promise. I would make sure it became a curse. The house would remain mine, not just in name, but in truth, and he would never again step across its threshold as if it were his. He had taken my dream and tried to corrupt it, but he had underestimated me. He thought I would shatter. Instead, I was already beginning to sharpen, and so I lay awake, listening to the sea crash against the shore, not as a lullaby this time, but as a reminder. Every wave that struck the sand was proof that no matter how many footprints walked upon it, the ocean would wash them away. His sentence had cut me like a knife. Yes, but it had also carved a new resolve into me. He had spoken his future. Now it was time for me to write mine. In the days that followed, I carried the sentence he had spoken like a shard of glass hidden in my chest, sharp enough to cut me whenever I allowed myself to think of it, yet useful in a way I hadn't expected. That pain became fuel, not for despair, but for focus. The ordinary rhythm of our life resumed in appearance, and I slipped back into it as though nothing had shifted, as though I hadn't seen him standing in the very center of my sanctuary, with another woman pressed close to his side, as though I hadn't heard him promise her a future in the house I had built for myself. I served meals, asked the casual questions wives are expected to ask, listened to his rehearsed stories about work and late meetings, all the while hiding the truth of what I knew beneath a mask so carefully arranged that even I almost believed it. Pretending nothing had happened became my greatest weapon. There is a strange kind of power in silence, one I had never fully understood until then. Anger reveals itself. It erupts. It warns the other person that the storm is coming. Tears do the same, betraying vulnerability and offering the guilty a chance to twist sympathy into control. But silence is unreadable. Silence forces the other person to wonder how much you know, if you know anything at all, if the careful scaffolding of their deception is still standing or already crumbling beneath them. By saying nothing, by carrying on with my daily routines, I planted a seed of unease in him, without ever lifting a finger. At first, he didn't notice. He was too comfortable in the lie he had built. too certain of his own cleverness. He moved through our home with the same careless entitlement as always, answering his phone in hushed tones when he thought I wasn't listening, disappearing for meetings that stretched late into the night. I nodded, smiled faintly, and let him think I accepted it all. I knew that any confrontation then would only rob me of control, would reduce me to another wounded wife begging for scraps of honesty. And I had no intention of giving him that satisfaction. I wanted more than his confession. I wanted his collapse. So I played my part with precision. When he returned home, I asked about his day with polite curiosity, never pressing too far, never prying enough to make him defensive. I set the table, poured the wine, and listened as he filled the silence with meaningless chatter, the same hollow words he had been speaking for years. Inside, I catalogued every detail, every gap in his story, every slip of the tongue. At times I wondered if he noticed the way I watched him now, the way my eyes lingered not with affection, but with study, as though I were examining a specimen rather than a husband. Perhaps he did, but if so, he convinced himself it was nothing more than fatigue or detachment. Let him believe that. It only worked in my favor. At night, I would lie beside him in bed, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, imagining the life he thought he was building in secret. Did he picture her there beside him in the house by the sea? Did he rehearse in his mind the conversations they would have over morning coffee on the terrace, the intimacy he thought he had rediscovered? If so, he had no idea that every fantasy of his was being quietly dismantled, that with each beat of the waves outside, his time was running out. My silence was not born of weakness, but of timing. I knew that to strike too early was to risk losing everything I wanted to protect and everything I wanted him to lose. The irony of it all was that he began to grow careless. Silence gave him confidence, or perhaps complacency. Believing I suspected nothing, he let small details slip through. A receipt tucked carelessly into his wallet, the faint trace of perfume on his shirt, a message left half-hidden on his phone. I did not confront him with these things. Instead, I stored them away, piece by piece, building the foundation of a case that needed no words, no arguments, no he said, she said. One day I knew I would not need to accuse him. I would only need to present the undeniable truth, and the world would turn against him without me ever raising my voice. I often thought back to that moment in the house, the way he had claimed it as his own, promised it to her with such certainty. It had been a knife then, but in my silence it became something else, a blueprint. I began to plan with the same precision I imagined he thought he had shown in his deceit. I met with my lawyer quietly, transferring documents, ensuring that the deed bore only my name, that there would be no question of ownership, no loophole through which he could crawl back. I made financial adjustments, securing accounts, redirecting assets, while still smiling across the dinner table as though nothing had shifted. It was a strange dual existence, this play I performed. Outwardly, I was the wife he believed he still controlled, docile and blind, content with the scraps of attention he offered. Inwardly, I was already free, already sharpening my strategy, already watching the clock count down to the moment when he would realize what my silence had concealed. Each day, each quiet nod, each polite smile was another step toward the unveiling, and though the silence was heavy at times, though the weight of pretending threatened to suffocate me, I found a kind of strength in it. I had thought his words would destroy me, that hearing him promise my dream to another would break me beyond repair. Instead, they had awakened something I had buried long ago, the certainty that I was capable of surviving without him, that I was capable of more than surviving. I was capable of triumph. I began to relish the act of silence, the way it gave me control he didn't even realize he had lost. The moment of pretending nothing had happened was not about denial. It was about design. I understood then that every word unspoken, every reaction withheld, was a move on a board he didn't know we were playing. And while he wasted his breath on promises whispered to someone else, I was building a future he would never see coming, a future in which the house by the sea would remain mine alone, and he would find himself standing on the outside of a locked door, wondering how he had failed to notice the silence speaking louder than anything I could have said. There is a peculiar stillness that comes when the house grows quiet at night, when the world outside is reduced to shadows, and the steady rhythm of the ocean beating against the shore. It was in that stillness that my thoughts sharpened most, when the mask I wore during the day could finally be lowered, and the silence I maintained became a private companion rather than a performance. I would sit alone at the wide window of the beach house, the curtains drawn back, the dark sea stretching endlessly before me, and I would let myself remember, not in the sentimental way that softens edges, but with the clarity of someone re-examining the ledger of her life, weighing what had been given against what had been received. I remembered the beginning of us, back when everything had been painted in promise and light. I remembered the days when I believed we were building something together, when I worked extra hours, saved every penny, and ignored my own desires so that we could create a future that seemed worth the sacrifice. I remembered the countless times I put him first, his career, his ambitions, his comfort, while convincing myself that one day it would all balance out, that one day I would step into a space where my needs mattered too. I had carried the weight of us, not because he asked me to, but because I believed love meant carrying, enduring, sustaining. Now, staring at the horizon, I realized I had confused sacrifice with worth. The house should have been proof of that worth. Every brick, every beam, every detail was purchased not just with money but with years of my patience, with the hours I gave to jobs that drained me, with the dreams I set aside so that his could flourish. And yet, when the moment came for the house to be a celebration, he turned it into a monument of betrayal. I thought of the way his voice had softened as he promised it to her, the way his eyes had gleamed as if he had discovered something new, when in truth it was only my labor, my devotion, my savings that had made it possible. To him, I had become invisible, a background presence erased so completely that he could give away what was mine without hesitation. As the hours of the night stretched long, I let myself feel the exhaustion of those years more deeply than I ever had before. The birthdays I spent waiting for him to come home, the dinners grown cold, the celebrations muted because he had other priorities, the way I convinced myself that loneliness was a temporary condition rather than the defining feature of our marriage. It all came back to me, not as a flood of sadness, but as a quiet reckoning. I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. I had been building a life for two, while he had been building a life for himself. My sacrifices were not unseen. They were simply unvalued. There is a kind of betrayal that cuts deeper than the act of infidelity itself, and that is the betrayal of dismissal, the slow erosion of significance until the person who once vowed to cherish you no longer even remembers your worth. That was what I saw now, illuminated in the darkness. The affair was not the beginning of his disloyalty. It was merely the conclusion of a story that had been unraveling for years, thread by thread, while I kept weaving more in an attempt to hold it together. And the cruelest part of all was how easily he had stepped into his new role, how effortlessly he had turned our history into a prelude for someone else. But reflection, for me, was no longer an act of mourning. It was preparation. Each night I sat in the quiet. I found myself growing steadier, colder, less shaken by the image of them together. The more I examined the ledger of my sacrifices, the more I realized how unbalanced it had always been, how little he had truly contributed compared to what I had given. That imbalance no longer filled me with sorrow. It filled me with resolve. I understood then that I owed him nothing, not even an explanation. He had already written himself out of the story. My task now was not to grieve, but to decide how to make his erasure permanent. I would stare at the waves until the horizon blurred, listening to the relentless crash and retreat of the tide, and I thought of time itself. The ocean did not apologize for erasing footprints in the sand. It simply did what it was meant to do. Perhaps that was my task now, not to explain, not to rage, but to act, to sweep away the traces of him with the same inevitability. The betrayal, once laid bare, did not diminish me. It clarified me. I was not the woman left behind. I was the woman standing in the house she had built, the woman who now knew the full extent of her own strength. When dawn finally crept across the sky and light returned to the walls, I felt a strange calmness settle inside me. It was as if I had passed through some unseen threshold in the night, moving from disbelief and hurt into something sharper, something decisive. The sacrifices were real, yes, but so was the betrayal. And now, With the weight of both clearly visible, I knew what needed to come next. The house would remain mine. He would never claim it, not with her, not alone. My silence had been my shield. Soon, it would become my sword. There comes a moment when grief transforms, when the weight of betrayal ceases to press downward, and instead sharpens into something that can be wielded. I felt it one morning as I stood in the kitchen of the beach house, the light pouring in through the wide glass doors and illuminating the table where I had spread out papers that no one else knew I had been collecting. Bank statements, receipts, records of transfers, pieces of a puzzle that told the real story of how this house had come into existence. They were more than numbers. They were the testimony of my years of sacrifice. He might have spoken words to another woman in these rooms, promising her a future he had no right to give. But the ink on those documents was mine. The signatures were mine. The sweat behind each payment belonged to me alone. That realization was the beginning of my plan, cold and precise, like the first stroke of a blade against stone. I began by retracing every decision I had made in acquiring the house, each payment and legal step. I had been careful from the start, cautious even in my excitement, ensuring that the property was purchased primarily in my name. At the time, it had been more habit than foresight, the product of years of quietly protecting myself against disappointments I never admitted aloud. Now, that instinct became my salvation. Still, I knew caution was not enough. If he discovered what I had already insured, he might try to twist it, to insert himself through manipulation or through law. I could not leave even the smallest door open. Every line on every deed had to be ironclad, untouchable, bearing only my name, so that when the time came for him to attempt his performance of ownership, he would find himself facing a wall he could not climb. The plan unfolded slowly at first, in whispers and private meetings, the kind of steps that required patience and discipline. I contacted my lawyer discreetly, a woman I trusted not because of friendship, but because of her reputation for being unflinching. In the sterile quiet of her office, I laid out what I wanted. Not explanations, not sympathy, only the certainty that no claim could be made against the house by anyone but me. She looked at me with a steady gaze, her pen tapping once against the table before she nodded. "It could be done," she said, "but it would require absolute precision. Every loophole had to be closed, every possibility accounted for." We began immediately. While the papers moved through the proper channels, I continued my performance at home. I greeted him as always, asked about his day, kept my tone light. At times it felt like standing on a stage, every smile rehearsed, every nod calculated. He did not suspect. His arrogance made him blind. He assumed my silence was ignorance, that my calmness was indifference. He mistook strategy for weakness, and that mistake was the very space in which my plan thrived. The more confident he grew, the more careless he became. And the more careless he became, the easier it was for me to prepare without fear of discovery. I remember one night in particular when he came home late, the faint trace of her perfume clinging to his clothes, his hair mussed from hands that were not mine. He slipped into bed beside me, whispering a vague apology about work, and I turned toward him with a soft smile, as though I believed him. Inside, I was already elsewhere, imagining the deed with his name absent, imagining the expression on his face when he returned to the beach house certain it belonged to him, only to find that the keys no longer opened the doors of his fantasy. That vision became my anchor, a private strength that kept me steady in the pretense of normalcy. It was not easy to maintain the duality of my life. By day, I was the unsuspecting wife, playing my role with measured grace. By night, I became the architect of his downfall, combing through contracts, reviewing clauses, ensuring that when the ink dried, it would dry in my favor alone. There were moments when the weight of secrecy pressed against me, when I longed to break the silence, to throw the truth in his face and watch the mask slip from his features. But I held back. I reminded myself that explosions burn fast and then fade, while slow, deliberate erosion destroys from the foundation up. I wanted not just a confrontation, but a collapse. As the weeks passed, the papers came together piece by piece, until the day arrived when the final signature was made, the final seal pressed. The deed was mine, fully, legally, irrevocably. It was not merely ownership on paper. It was the transformation of my pain into protection, of my betrayal into a shield. I felt it as a physical shift inside me, a release of the tension that had gripped my chest since the day I saw him in that house with her. Now, when I walked through the rooms, I no longer saw only the stain of their presence. I saw the certainty that this place would never belong to anyone but me. And yet, I told him nothing. That was the sharpest edge of my plan. The silence that made him believe he was safe, that allowed him to continue dreaming aloud with her, to speak of futures he would never see. Each word he uttered in his fantasy became another thread in the trap he was weaving for himself. He did not know that while he was promising her the walls of my house, the doors had already been locked against him, the foundation secured beneath my name alone. At night, I would sit again at the window, listening to the ocean, and I felt the coldness of my resolve settle more firmly within me. He had tried to take my dream, to twist it into a stage for his betrayal. Instead, he had handed me the opportunity to ensure his erasure. The plan was no longer fragile, no longer tentative. It was complete. All that remained was time, the patient waiting for the moment when the curtain would finally fall, and he would realize what my silence had been hiding all along. There is an art to confrontation, a way of testing the waters without ever showing that you are the one holding the match above the oil. I learned that art in silence, in the long weeks where I carried knowledge hidden beneath the surface of ordinary days. When the deed had finally been secured, when I knew beyond doubt that the house was legally untouchable, something inside me shifted from pure strategy to subtle theater. I no longer needed to merely pretend ignorance. I could now begin to thread hints into the fabric of our conversations, tiny fractures in the mask of compliance that would leave him questioning how much I really knew. The beauty of it was that he would never be able to tell if my words were casual remarks or sharpened daggers designed to cut in places he did not expect. It began innocently enough, or at least that is how I made it appear. One evening we sat together at the dinner table, the clinking of silverware filling the silence more than our voices did. I watched him carefully, the way his eyes darted to his phone whenever it buzzed, the way he kept his answers clipped and vague, as though afraid too many words might betray him. I took a sip of wine and, in the most casual tone I could summon, I said, "I drove down to the beach house last week. It's amazing how much it feels like home already." His fork paused midair, only for a fraction of a second, but I caught it. A flicker of tension across his features, quickly masked by a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's good," he replied, his voice a little too even. "I'm glad you're enjoying it." I tilted my head, allowing my smile to linger just enough to unsettle. "You know, it's funny. Sometimes I feel like the walls there already have stories of their own, as if they've seen more than I realize." His knuckles whitened slightly against the stem of his glass, but he said nothing. I let the silence stretch, then changed the subject entirely, leaving him suspended in that uncertainty. It was a seed, small but deliberate, and I knew it would take root in his mind. From then on, I wove such moments into our routine, never obvious, always disguised. A passing comment about how sturdy the locks were, or how important it felt to know exactly who belonged in the house. A remark about how interesting it is that voices can carry so far in quiet places, how sometimes you can hear things even when you're not supposed to. Each word was layered, each phrase designed to sound harmless but carry weight just heavy enough to make him wonder if his secrets were still safe. The brilliance of it was that I never accused, never demanded, never even hinted directly at betrayal. I simply planted doubt and let it grow. The effect on him was subtle at first, but then it began to show. He grew restless, more defensive about his whereabouts, more careful with his phone. He started to watch me more closely, as though trying to decipher whether my words were coincidence or intent. At times, I would catch him studying me across the room, his brow furrowed, his lips pressed thin, but he never dared to ask what I meant. To ask would be to confess. Instead, he drowned himself in feigned normalcy, forcing laughter where none belonged, making exaggerated efforts to appear attentive, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. One night, as we sat together with the television humming in the background, I let my voice drop low, as if lost in thought, and said, "It's strange how quickly people forget that nothing hidden stays hidden forever." He turned his head sharply toward me, eyes narrowing, but I simply smiled faintly and asked him if he wanted more tea. The trap was not in the words themselves, but in their delivery, in the way they hung between us like smoke, impossible to grasp, but impossible to ignore. What fascinated me was how my silence had evolved into this new form, how it no longer needed to remain passive, but could now become an active weapon, a tool of psychological pressure. I didn't need to scream or demand. I only needed to let him drown in his own imagination. He didn't know what I had seen, what I had heard, what I had discovered. He only knew that something in me had shifted, that my composure was no longer the indifference he believed it to be, but something more dangerous. And in his uncertainty, he began to falter. He would retreat more often into late-night drives, claiming stress from work, but I could see it in the way he checked my expression before leaving, as though expecting me to stop him. I never did. Instead, I let him spiral, let him suspect that at any moment his carefully balanced lie might collapse. The confrontation was never about catching him in a scene or forcing a confession. It was about turning his own deception into a cage he could no longer escape. Each disguised remark was another bar in that cage, invisible yet unyielding, and still, I remained outwardly calm, tending to the small rituals of our life, preparing meals, folding laundry, maintaining the facade. I wanted him to feel both safe and threatened at once, wanted him to live in the dissonance of thinking he was in control while sensing that he was not. That was the essence of the disguised confrontation, to make him fight shadows, to let him destroy himself with the suspicion that I was no longer blind. In those days, I discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed, not the kind of strength that comes from endurance alone, but the strength of manipulation, of shaping the narrative without ever raising my voice. He had believed he was the only one capable of playing a double life, of performing one role while living another. But he was wrong. I could act too, and I could act better. Because while he spun fantasies built on lies, I spun truths wrapped in silence, and the difference was that my stage had already been secured. The deed was mine. The plan was in motion, and he was only a character walking unknowingly into his own downfall. The day he chose to return to the beach house was bright, the kind of morning when the sunlight seems almost too generous, casting everything in a golden glow that disguises the shadows beneath. I had woken early, as was my habit now, sitting by the wide window that looked out over the restless ocean, my coffee cooling untouched in my hands. I knew, in a way that cannot be explained by reason alone, that the moment I had been preparing for was close. For weeks, the tension in him had been mounting, his behavior a tangle of unease and bravado, and I had seen the restless impatience in his eyes, the way he carried himself like a man waiting for the final act of a performance he thought he had written. When I heard the car pull into the driveway and the crunch of gravel under tires, there was no surprise in me, only the calm certainty that this was the day everything would be revealed. I did not rush to greet him. I let the sound of doors opening, voices laughing, and footsteps approaching drift through the walls before I moved. He had brought her with him, of course. His mistress, the woman he believed would now inhabit the home he had promised her in whispers. Their voices carried into the air with that careless joy of people convinced they were walking into a future that already belonged to them. I imagined him pointing out the windows, the terrace, the sea, just as he had before, rehearsing the same lines, weaving the same fantasy. What he did not know was that the house he had claimed for them both had already been transformed into something impenetrable, something sealed off against his intrusion. When I finally opened the front door, I did so slowly, deliberately, so that the moment would unfold not as an explosion, but as an unveiling. He turned toward me, surprise flickering across his face, quickly replaced by the smile of a man who thinks he can control the narrative. "You're here," he said, as though my presence required explanation, as though I were the intruder in the home I had bought. I watched the woman beside him glance at me, curiosity laced with the faint arrogance of someone who believed she had already replaced me. "Yes," I answered simply, stepping aside so they could enter. I let them walk past me into the living room, let them carry their illusion with them for a few more breaths. I wanted them to feel it, to believe it fully, because only then could the truth strike with its full weight. He gestured toward the wide glass doors that opened onto the terrace, speaking to her in that familiar tone of possession. "This is where we'll have our mornings. The sea is even more beautiful when the light hits it just right." She laughed softly, leaning against him, and for a moment, they looked like any couple planning a shared life. That was when I placed the folder on the table. Thick, heavy, filled with the documents that bore my name, and my name alone. The sound of it against the wood was louder than I expected, sharp enough to make them both turn. He frowned, confusion flickering across his face, then irritation, as though my presence with paperwork was an interruption to his script. I did not raise my voice, did not dramatize. I simply spoke with the calmness I had been perfecting for weeks. "You've been mistaken," I said, my eyes steady on his. "This house is not yours. It was never yours, and it will never be yours." He laughed at first, the hollow laugh of a man who believes charm can erase facts. "What are you talking about? Don't be ridiculous. We'll work this out." But when he opened the folder and saw the seals, the signatures, the legal certainty of ownership, his face drained of color. The words caught in his throat, his jaw tightening as he flipped through page after page, each one a wall closing around him. She leaned closer, peering at the documents, her expression shifting from confusion to unease, until she pulled slightly away from him, no longer resting against his side. I stood there silently, letting the truth settle in the air, letting him absorb what his arrogance had blinded him to. His hand trembled as he placed the papers back on the table, his eyes darting toward me with a mixture of disbelief and rage. "You can't do this," he muttered, but even he seemed to know how hollow the words were. I tilted my head slightly, not with pity, not with triumph, but with the cold finality of someone who has already won. "I already have," I replied. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. The sea roared faintly beyond the glass doors, the only witness to the collapse of his fantasy. He looked at her, perhaps for reassurance, perhaps for solidarity, but she had already stepped back, her gaze flicking toward the exit, as though calculating how quickly she could leave this crumbling stage. The cracks in their alliance began to show in real time. Her whispered questions met with his desperate half-answers, the dream they had woven together unraveling before it had even begun. I did not need to say more. The house itself spoke through the documents on the table, through the unyielding certainty of the law. I had given him nothing to argue against, no accusation to deny, no emotion to manipulate. Only facts. And facts were merciless. He stood in the middle of the living room, the same space where he had once declared to her that this would be their home, and he realized now it would never belong to him. The keys in his pocket were worthless. The promises he had made were ashes, and the smile he had worn so easily was gone, replaced by a tightness around his mouth that revealed the truth of his defeat. When they finally left, the sound of their retreating footsteps echoed strangely, as if the house itself was reclaiming its silence. I closed the door behind them and stood for a long time in the quiet, breathing in the salt air that drifted through the windows. It was over. The day of truth had come, and it had unfolded exactly as I had planned, not with screaming or spectacle, but with the calm precision of inevitability. The house was mine, untouchable, a fortress not just of walls and beams, but of resolve, and he would never again walk through its doors believing it belonged to him. The memory of that day lingered in the air long after the sound of their retreating footsteps had vanished, like smoke that clings to walls no matter how wide the windows are opened. I stood in the center of the living room, watching the sunlight spill across the table where the folder still lay, its papers fanned like the wings of some unyielding truth. He had left without words that mattered, only mutters of disbelief and anger that dissolved into silence the moment the door closed behind him. She had left even more quickly, her heels clicking against the tiles with the urgency of someone who wanted to flee, not just the house, but the humiliation itself. I thought that would be enough, that watching the collapse of his fantasy, the unraveling of his lies, would seal the matter. But men like him rarely accept silence as an ending. They always come back, certain that persistence or charm or rage can undo what has already been written in stone. And so he did. It was a week later when he returned, alone this time, his car once again in the driveway, like an unwelcome shadow. I had been expecting it. Defeat had burned on his face the last time, but I knew pride is a stubborn flame, unwilling to die without one last struggle. I opened the door before he could knock, standing there with the steadiness I had cultivated through months of silence. He looked at me with a mixture of anger and desperation, the kind of expression that belongs to a man who realizes the stage he built has crumbled, yet still believes he can improvise his way into another ending. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tight, stripped of its usual confidence. "There's nothing left to talk about," I replied, my tone even, unshaken. But he pushed past me anyway, stepping into the house as though he still had the right. That intrusion, that arrogance, was the spark that set everything ablaze inside me. For weeks I had allowed silence to be my weapon. For weeks I had let calculation do the work of confrontation. But in that moment, standing in the house I had fought to reclaim, I knew the final blow could not be hidden in quiet strategy. It had to be spoken, sharp and undeniable, so that there would be no mistake left in his mind. He began his performance immediately, pacing the room, gesturing toward the windows as though rehearsing his old lines. "This is our house," he said, his voice cracking on the word "our." "You can't just shut me out. After everything, after all the years, this is as much mine as it is yours." His words fell flat against the walls, echoes of a lie that had already been dismantled. I let him speak, let him pour out his mixture of anger and plea, until the air was heavy with his desperation. Then, when his voice faltered, I stepped closer, my gaze fixed on his. "This house is not yours," I said, each word deliberate, cold enough to cut. "It never was, and you will never set foot here again." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. His eyes widened, his mouth opened and closed, but no words came. It was as though the reality of his defeat had finally pierced through the armor of his arrogance. He looked around the room, his gaze desperate, as if searching for something to hold on to, some thread of control that might still exist, but there was nothing left. The deed, the law, the truth, all of it was against him, and worse, so was I. He tried one last time, his voice breaking into something rawer. "You can't just erase me," he said, almost whispering, almost pleading. I felt a strange calmness wash over me then, the kind that comes not from rage but from certainty. "I'm not erasing you," I replied. "You erased yourself the moment you stood here with her and called this your home. All I've done is make sure that lie never becomes reality." His shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him, leaving only the shell of a man who realized too late that he had lost everything. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes dark with something between fury and grief, then turned toward the door. I followed him, not rushing, not raising my voice, but ensuring he understood that every step he took was a step away from a life that no longer included me, no longer included this house, no longer included the dream he had stolen and destroyed. When the door closed behind him this time, it was final. There would be no more intrusions, no more attempts to reclaim what was never his. The house stood silent again, the walls free of his voice, the air free of his lies. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, the windows, the door frames, as though reintroducing myself to a place that was once tainted by betrayal, but was now purified by truth. Each step was lighter than the last, each breath deeper, until I reached the terrace and let the sea wind wash over me. "You will never set foot here again," I whispered into the air, not because he could hear me, but because the house itself deserved to hear it. The ocean roared in response, endless and eternal, and I felt for the first time that the dream I had once bought for myself had been restored, not just as a sanctuary, but as a monument to survival. He was gone. The house was mine, and nothing could change that now. After the final door closed behind him, and his shadow no longer darkened the threshold of my dream house, a silence settled that was unlike any silence I had known before. It was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of secrets, nor the brittle stillness of suppressed grief. This silence was clean, expansive, a silence that belonged to me alone, filled with the sounds I chose, the low hum of the ocean, the rustle of curtains in the breeze, the quiet rhythm of my own breathing as I moved through the rooms that were finally mine. For the first time in years, I felt unburdened, as though a weight I had grown accustomed to carrying had been lifted so completely that I almost stumbled without it. But I did not fall. I walked steadier, stronger, into a life that no longer required me to shrink, to endure, to sacrifice for someone who never valued the gift. The days that followed became a process of reclaiming not just the house, but myself. I began with small gestures, details that might seem trivial to anyone else but were profound to me. I removed the last traces of him from the rooms, the forgotten jacket in a closet, the photograph that once stood on the nightstand, the faint indentation on the pillow beside mine. Each item carried the echo of a life that had ended, and I released them one by one, watching as the house shed its ghosts and grew lighter. I filled the empty spaces with pieces of myself I had long neglected, books I had always meant to read, art I had admired but never dared to buy, flowers that bloomed in colors I had been told were too much. The house reflected me now, not a compromise, not a stage for someone else's performance, but a sanctuary that spoke in my voice. And as the house transformed, so did I. I began to spend mornings on the terrace, watching the sunrise over the ocean with a cup of coffee in my hand, not waiting for anyone to join me, not wishing for anyone to fill the silence. I realized then that solitude was not loneliness. Solitude was a form of strength, a reminder that I could exist fully without being defined by another. In the evenings, I walked barefoot along the shore, letting the tide wash over my feet, feeling the sand shift and reform beneath me. The sea became my companion, its rhythm steady and eternal, its lessons clear. Everything changes, everything renews, and nothing lost cannot be replaced by something stronger. People noticed the change in me, though few understood its cause. Friends commented on the way my eyes seemed brighter, on the steadiness of my smile. They assumed perhaps that the beach house itself had revived me, that proximity to the ocean had given me back what time and disappointment had drained. They could not see the deeper truth, that I had walked through betrayal and emerged not broken, but sharpened, not diminished, but reborn. I did not correct them. Some truths are too intimate to be explained, and besides, their guesses mattered less than the reality I now lived. He tried, of course, to reach out in the weeks that followed. Men like him always do. There were messages filled with apologies, explanations, half-hearted claims of love. There were promises of change, of starting again, of lessons learned too late. I read them with the same detachment one reads an old script from a play no longer being performed. His words had no power over me now. He was a voice echoing from another life, and I did not answer. Not out of spite, but out of liberation. The final blow had already been delivered. Nothing he could say would undo it, and nothing I could say would matter more than the silence that stretched between us. The mistress, too, faded from the edges of my story. Whatever promises he had given her dissolved in the light of truth, and she moved on to seek another dream, perhaps her own, or perhaps someone else's. I thought of her less and less, not with anger, but with indifference. She had been part of his betrayal, yes, but she had never been the architect of my pain. That was his alone, and so was the ruin he carried with him now. My life no longer bent around either of them. It bent toward me, toward the horizon, toward the endless expanse of possibility that lay ahead. In the quiet of my evenings, as I sat with the ocean stretching before me, I often thought of the woman I had been when I first bought the house. Hopeful, naive perhaps, still believing that love could be salvaged if only I sacrificed more of myself. I wanted to reach back to her, to tell her that the dream she carried was worth more than the man she gave it to, that she would one day stand stronger than she imagined. But perhaps she needed to walk through the fire of betrayal to understand it, to become the woman I am now. Pain has a way of reshaping us, of stripping us down until only what is essential remains. And what remained in me was not weakness, but resilience. The house by the sea became more than a dream realized. It became a symbol of survival, a reminder that betrayal is not the end of the story, but the beginning of another. It stood white and luminous against the horizon, its walls echoing not with lies, but with the sound of waves, its windows opening not to promises broken but to freedom reclaimed. I would live here, not as a woman defined by what she lost, but as a woman who reclaimed what was hers, and discovered that her worth had never depended on anyone else's recognition. And so the story closed not with bitterness, but with renewal. He would never set foot inside again. That chapter was finished, sealed, forgotten by the tides. What remained was me, standing at the edge of the ocean, alive, unbroken, and reborn. The sea stretched endlessly before me, whispering of futures I had yet to claim, and for the first time, I walked toward them without fear, knowing that this was not the end, but the truest beginning of my life.